Welcome to History's Mysteries, a place where the echoes of the past linger in the quiet of night. Here, forgotten worlds awaken softly, and the stories of time unfold like dreams. So settle in, breathe deeply, and let history whisper you to sleep. 3I Atlas, the visitor beyond the sun. The sky was quiet that night when the new object appeared. No sudden burst of light, no comet's tail sweeping across the heavens, just a subtle glint, emerald and alive, drifting beyond the rim of Saturn's domain. Astronomers first noticed it by accident, a flicker in their instruments that refused to behave like anything familiar. They named it 3I/ATLAS, the third interstellar object ever recorded, and within days it began to stir questions that no telescope could fully answer. Unlike Oumuamua, the first wanderer, which had tumbled past Earth like a shard of dark glass, or Borisov, the comet that resembled a wayward snowball, Atlas shimmered as though it were alive. Its surface reflected sunlight in complex rhythms, pulsing with faint but repeating patterns of light. At first, researchers dismissed them as mere rotation, sunlight flashing off uneven ice. But when the timing of those pulses repeated every 131 seconds with perfect regularity, the story changed. Something was transmitting, something was speaking through silence. In the cold halls of observatories across the world, from Mauna Kea to the Atacama Plateau, from the European Southern Observatory to NASA's infrared arrays, the data streams were rerun again and again. 3I/ATLAS's orbit was unlike any seen before. It wasn't falling into the solar system, it was navigating it. Its path curved just enough to suggest correction, as though tiny jets or forces beyond human understanding guided it through the gravity wells of the planets. Some called it coincidence. Others, quietly, whispered the word intention. As it neared the orbit of Jupiter, its emerald glow deepened. Radio telescopes began to pick up faint static, pulses buried in the cosmic background noise. At first, it was random, the kind of interference every astronomer learns to ignore. But over the following weeks, patterns began to emerge. A sequence of frequencies, prime numbers, mirrored intervals, and harmonic waves that echoed the resonance of hydrogen itself. To the trained ear, it was almost melodic. Music of something older than civilization. Governments formed committees. Research teams spoke in code. The public, unaware at first, caught wind of strange activity in the astronomical community. Internet forums came alive with theories that ATLAS was an alien probe, that it was a cosmic messenger, or that it was something far older, something Earth had once known and forgotten. And then, an archaeologist working in the ruins of southern Crete noticed something remarkable. On a faded fragment of Minoan pottery, a swirl of emerald pigment circled a central sphere, its spiral arms marked with tiny dots. The artifact, carbon dated to 1500 BCE, bore an inscription not in words, but in geometric lines. When measured, the ratios between the markings matched the orbital path of 3I/ATLAS. It was as if an ancient culture had recorded the arrival of the same object thousands of years before. Word spread among researchers in archaeoastronomy, the study of how ancient civilizations tracked the stars. From Egypt to Polynesia, records of a green wanderer surfaced. The Egyptians called it Sephet Heru, the eye of the sky falcon. The Maori spoke of Te Tuaori, the traveler between worlds. In Sumerian texts, a mysterious glyph appeared only once. Ludingirur, the shining stranger. Each reference appeared in periods of upheaval, times when civilizations rose or fell, when calendars reset, and when new myths began. As these ancient echoes resurfaced, 3I/ATLAS passed the orbit of Mars. Its surface emitted brief flashes in the ultraviolet spectrum, too regular to be natural. NASA's spectroscopic data showed no ordinary mineral reflection. It contained compounds unknown to Earth's periodic inventory. Something crystalline, something that refracted light in non-random polarizations. When plotted on a graph, the wavelengths formed symmetrical curves, resembling written language. The scientific community split in two. One half clung to the safety of astrophysical explanations, exotic ices, unusual compositions, and magnetic interference. The other half, the quiet few who studied both science and history, recognized a pattern older than equations. A code embedded not just in the signal, but in the geometry of the stars themselves. Among these was Dr. Helena Mora, a linguist turned astrobiologist at the European Space Agency. Late one night, as she overlaid the pulse intervals from ATLAS with the Earth's Schumann resonance, a faint electromagnetic heartbeat that hums through the planet's atmosphere, she found synchronization. The object's pulses matched the natural frequency of Earth's ionosphere, as if the two were harmonizing. The visitor was not only seen, but also heard by the planet itself. News of her discovery never reached the public. The data was sealed, her system quarantined, and her findings buried under layers of bureaucracy. But whispers spread. Something vast was coming, and those who stared too long at the data began to dream. They described vast geometric shapes drifting in darkness, rings of light, spirals turning inward, and cities carved into the void, dreams of being watched from beyond the sun. Then, as if to answer the growing wonder, the object slowed. By all mathematical accounts, it should have accelerated toward the sun's pull. Instead, it began to drift outward again, adjusting its trajectory with subtle precision. It aimed for a solar flyby that would bring it within 0.4 astronomical units of the star, a path perilously close for any known object. Yet somehow, its structure remained intact. As it reached perihelion, something extraordinary occurred. The sun's magnetic field, normally turbulent and chaotic, stabilized around it. Solar flares diminished. The corona shimmered with symmetrical ripples, forming what one satellite technician described as a halo. For 72 minutes, the sun appeared to breathe in rhythm with 3I/ATLAS, its light dimming and brightening as if responding to an invisible conversation. Then, in one blinding moment, a pulse radiated outward, not light, but structured energy, a wave detectable across every instrument on Earth. Clocks faltered, magnetic compasses spun, radio waves dropped into silence. For those awake beneath the night sky, a green shimmer spread across the horizon, visible even at the equator. It wasn't aurora, but something deeper, a curtain of charged mist that moved as though alive. The pulse lasted exactly 1 hour. When it ended, 3I/ATLAS was gone. Not vanished entirely, but dimmed to invisibility. Its reflection disappeared from telescopes. Its signal ceased. For the first time since discovery, the sky was empty again. Only afterward did scientists realize that the pulse had carried a pattern, an imprint embedded in the atmosphere. In the ionosphere, faint electromagnetic echoes began to hum, repeating every few hours. The pattern was unmistakable: a map. At first glance, it resembled a spiral galaxy, but as analysts compared the coordinates, they realized it wasn't a map of the stars. It was a projection of the Earth, continents, oceans, and tectonic outlines, all present but subtly altered. Africa extended differently. The poles shifted. Coastlines were not the ones known today, but those of millennia past, and possibly of ages yet to come. Across observatories, silence settled. The visitor had not spoken in words, but in reflection. It had shown Earth to itself. Governments debated whether to reveal this to the public. The consensus was quiet suppression. The event was labeled an electromagnetic anomaly caused by solar interaction. Yet thousands of people around the world reported vivid dreams in the days that followed. Dreams of light flowing like rivers, of cities beneath oceans, of ancient voices speaking through stone. In the silence that followed, Dr. Mora began her own search. She traveled to Delphi, to the island of Delos, and to the caves beneath Malta, following faint traces of myth that spoke of a cosmic architect, the Titan Atlas, who held not the world upon his shoulders, but knowledge. In a crumbling codex known as the Atlas Mechanikos, she found references to a celestial engine that turns with the stars and sends forth the green, herald once every 10,000 years. Text described it as both machine and messenger, a construct built not by gods, but by those who came before the gods themselves. And beneath the layers of poetic language, she found numbers, coordinates, planetary ratios, and orbital equations written in ancient Greek script that, when plotted, aligned perfectly with the trajectory of 3I/ATLAS. Could not be a coincidence. Someone thousands of years ago had known. Someone had seen this before. As the world moved on, as headlines faded and telescopes turned elsewhere, a few still listened. Radio arrays kept open channels aimed at the void, scanning for the pulse that had silenced the Earth. And then, weeks later, faintly, a return signal whispered through the noise, so weak it nearly went unnoticed. It carried no message, no words, only one repeating sound, the resonance of the human heartbeat. At first, the signal was dismissed as interference. A heartbeat echoing from space sounded too poetic to be real, too much like the wishful thinking of a species longing not to be alone. But when technicians in 3 different observatories, one in Chile, one in Japan, and one in South Africa, reported the same pattern at the same time, coincidence became impossible to ignore. The rhythm was slow and steady, hovering just below the average human pulse, 61 beats per minute. Each beat was accompanied by a faint rise in radio intensity, as though a distant drum were being struck in the vacuum between stars. It came from the direction opposite the sun, as if bouncing from a point beyond the plane of the solar system, reflecting off some invisible surface. Dr. Helena Mora sat alone in the late hours, listening to the translation of the signal turned into sound. Each beat was soft, muffled, and more like a distant echo than a direct call. She closed her eyes and let the rhythm wash over her, imagining herself as just another flicker inside a vast and pulsing universe. The thought came to her quietly, not as a revelation, but as a gentle suggestion. This was not the heartbeat of a human, it was the heartbeat of recognition. They had answered. In the days that followed, the signal strengthened. It did not vary and did not include the complex structure of the earlier prime number pulses. Instead, it remained simple and unchanging, as if to say, We have heard you, and we are keeping time with you. The Schumann resonance of Earth, the planet's own electromagnetic hum, subtly shifted in response. The two beats, planetary and cosmic, began to drift into phase, overlapping for moments like two voices singing in unison. Around the world, sensitive instruments recorded small anomalies. Pendulums in old physics laboratories swung a fraction wider. Seismographs picked up the faintest of murmurs, not from tectonic plates, but from something in the planet's magnetic skin. The auroras at the poles flickered with an occasional green that matched the spectral fingerprint of 3I/ATLAS, even though the object itself had vanished from sight. No official explanation was offered. Nothing appeared in the news. Yet those who spent their nights beneath the sky, the astronomers, the navigators, the quiet watchers, felt that something vast and slow was unfolding, a process measured not in days or years, but in ages. Helena travelled again, drawn by an intuition she could not fully articulate. The Atlas Mechanicus Codex had mentioned more than coordinates and ratios. Buried between equations, a line of verse had haunted her. When the green herald comes and the star's breath quiets, the world will be inscribed upon the turning sky. She thought about the ionosphere, that thin shell of charged particles ringing the planet like a halo. She thought about the hour of green light, the map-like pattern that had appeared in its electromagnetic structure. What if the inscription was not a metaphor, but literal? In a stone circle in the hills of Western Europe, Helena laid a portable receiver upon one of the weathered slabs. The standing stones had once been aligned with solstices and stars, erected by hands that knew the sky intimately. Many thought of them as temples, graves, or calendars. But as she listened to the slow heartbeat signal through her headphones, she began to entertain another possibility. They might also be anchors, physical markers of places where Earth's skin was thin, where sky and stone spoke more clearly to each other. The receiver whispered in her ear. The pulse matched the data from the observatories, 61 beats per minute, unwavering, coming from far beyond the sun. Yet, faintly, she detected a modulation, a tremor riding on the edge of each beat. She replayed it, enhanced it, and stretched it in time. A pattern emerged, not unlike the geomagnetic shapes she had seen from satellites during the green hour. Peaks and valleys, rising and falling like the outline of coastlines. She put the spectrogram next to an ancient map of the world, not because she expected them to match, but because she wanted to see them together. The resemblance was subtle, but unmistakable. The pulse carried an imprint of Earth's geography. With each beat, a ghostly outline of continents and oceans shimmered in the data. The message, if it could be called that, was simple. We see you. Elsewhere, other minds began to connect other threads. A radio enthusiast on a small island in the Pacific recorded the heartbeat signal with homemade equipment and overlaid it with recordings of traditional navigation chants, the songs Polynesian wayfinders had used to cross the ocean by the stars. To his surprise, certain intervals matched the rhythm of the old songs, as if his ancestors had once echoed the same cosmic tempo. In the Andean highlands, an archaeoastronomer traced the orientation of ancient temples and sighting towers. Some pointed to solstice sunrises or important stars. Others, inexplicably, aligned with nothing obvious in the modern sky. When she extended those alignments beyond the plane of the solar system using modern software, the few intersected with the long-ago path of 3I/ATLAS. It was as if the builders had known where the Green Wanderer would appear long before any telescope was invented. On the Giza Plateau, the shafts of the Great Pyramid had long been thought to point towards certain stars in Orion and Sirius. But when one researcher re-examined their precise angles in light of the new data, he realized that at a different epoch, thousands of years ago, those shafts would have aligned not with ordinary stars, but with a position in the sky now associated with the inbound trajectory of ATLAS. The pyramid, in its own way, looked not just outward, but ahead. Again and again, the same pattern revealed itself. Megaliths, pyramids, earthworks, stone roads, and deserted observatories, great bones of ancient civilizations, seemed to sketch out fragments of a larger design. None of them made sense in isolation. Together, guided by the pulse from beyond the sun, they began to resemble something else. A global array. Not antennas in the technological sense, but resonant structures, a lattice of stone, earth, and intention, capable of shaping the way Earth responded to cosmic influences. Long before steel and satellites, people had built with the only materials they had, tuning their monuments not just to the turning of seasons, but to visitors whose return cycle could span thousands of years. The notion that 3I/ATLAS was a starship began to feel too small. The object had not stopped to orbit Earth and had not deployed craft or beams. It had passed close to the sun, altered the star's rhythm, imprinted a map into the planet's sky, and then continued on its way. It behaved less like a vehicle and more like a key, one that fit into the locks of stellar magnetic fields and planetary resonances, turning silently and then moving on. What it unlocked, Helena realized, was not a door in space, but a door in time. In quiet archives, she and a handful of colleagues began to reread myths with new eyes. Stories of world ages, of golden eras followed by decline, of floods and fires and the resetting of calendars. Again and again they found references to a new counting that began after a visitor in the sky, a green star in Egyptian texts, a wandering eye in early Mediterranean inscriptions, a second sun in Mesoamerican codices, remembered as a good omen by some, a terrible portent by others. What if those ages were not purely symbolic? What if they measured intervals between visitations? No one spoke publicly about this. The data was fragile, the patterns easy to dismiss. But alone, in the long hours between dusk and dawn, Helena allowed herself to imagine the broader design. Perhaps, scattered across the galaxy, there were countless worlds like Earth, each with its own oceans and atmospheres, its own restless life. Perhaps each of those worlds had once, or would one day, see a similar emerald wanderer brush past its sun, quieting the star for a moment, leaving behind a memory written into the sky. In that view, 3I/ATLAS was not unique. It was one node in a great circulating system, a slow-moving messenger that carried updates from world to world. Not messages in language or images, but maps compressed, encoded, and translated into the resonances of local space. When it reached a star, it tuned itself to the stellar field, imprinted the pattern of the worlds it had visited, and took with it the imprint of the new world it had just observed. An atlas, not of roads or kingdoms, but of living planets. The thought was humbling. Humans had always drawn maps from their vantage point, placing themselves at the center, continents stretching outward, seas bordering familiar shores. But this atlas, if that was truly what atlas was, did not care whom it placed in the middle. It simply wove each world into a larger web, an ever-growing cartography of life itself. As the weeks became months, the heartbeat signal slowly began to fade. Its tempo never varied. It did not accelerate or slow, but its strength diminished, like a distant beacon receding into deeper fog. Radio telescopes strained to collect the last of its whispers. Amateur sky watchers who had found comfort in knowing that something out there beat in time with their own hearts listened until there was nothing left but ordinary static. The green traces in the auroras lingered a little longer, a subtle hue riding atop the usual curtains of light at the poles. Pilots flying night routes at high latitudes sometimes reported an odd sense of calm when the sky glowed that particular shade, as if the world were remembering something important, but not quite bringing it to mind. Then, gradually, the color faded back into the familiar blues and violets of charged particles spiraling down magnetic lines. The map in the ionosphere, however, did not simply vanish. It grew quieter and less pronounced, but careful measurements suggested that its pattern had been absorbed into the planet's natural resonances. Like ink soaking into paper, the imprint had become part of the background. It was no longer an event, it was a condition. Earth had been marked. No one could say what that would ultimately mean. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything. Helena found herself one evening standing on a quiet shore, far from cities and their drifting haze of light. The sea was dark and still, a mirror stretching toward the horizon. Above it, stars trembled in the cold air. She thought about the fishermen and sailors of old, who had steered their small boats by those same lights, trusting patterns they barely understood. They, too, had been part of the story, drawing invisible lines between points in the sky, teaching their children to see those lines not as arbitrary, but as meaningful. Now she was doing something similar on a grander scale, tracing connections between stars, planets, and an enigmatic green visitor. Yet for all her instruments and equations, she felt no closer to certainty than they had. The mystery remained, vast and patient. As she watched, a faint meteor streaked across the sky, burning briefly before fading. It left no trace the eye could see, but somewhere in the thin shells of the atmosphere, a few atoms had been altered forever. The universe marked its moments in subtle ways. That night, as she lay awake with the window open to the cool air, she imagined the galaxy from far above, its spiral arms drifting like the petals of a frozen flower. Somewhere along those arms, she pictured innumerable suns, each with their own retinues of planets. Some worlds would be barren rock, others boiling gas, but a few, just a precious few, would have oceans and skies and beings who looked up and wondered. Perhaps, on one of those distant worlds, another observer was doing exactly what she was, listening to the echo of a visitor that had just passed their star, tracing the changes in their own sky, and rereading their own oldest stories. Maybe they, too, had monuments aligned to mysterious points, and songs that matched the rhythm of a fading beat. She thought of the atlas again, now not as a book or a machine, but as a web of shared awareness. Each world added its outline to the pattern. Each one, upon being inscribed, became aware that there were others. No coordinates were exchanged, and no messages were decoded in neat sentences. Only this understanding, we are part of something larger than ourselves. Time moved on in the way it always does. News cycles shifted to other topics. New discoveries flashed across screens only to be forgotten in days. Telescopes were retasked to chase other comets and other exoplanets. But the quiet records remained. Data archived in observatory servers, backups stored on cold drives, measurements etched into reports that only a few would ever read. In small corners of the world, the Green Wanderer lived on in softer ways. Artists painted swirling emerald comets over ancient stone circles. Poets wrote about a heartbeat in the sky. Children, who had been born just before the event and were now old enough to ask questions, listened to stories of the night the world glowed green for an hour. The tales were embellished, as stories often are, but beneath the exaggeration, a simple truth persisted. Something had come close, touched the sun, and then gone away, leaving humanity with a sense that the sky was not as empty as it once seemed. Helena continued her work, but with a gentler urgency. She did not expect the visitor to return within her lifetime. The cycles hinted at in the Atlas Mechanicos and other ancient sources suggested intervals of many thousands of years. When Atlas next brushes past the sun, the continents might be slightly different, languages unrecognizable, and perhaps even the very shapes of human beings altered by time and circumstance. She would become, at best, a small footnote, a name in the lineage of those who had tried to understand. Yet that thought did not sadden her. In a way, it comforted her. The Atlas was not about individuals or even single civilizations. It was about continuity, about the long, slow stitching of minds and worlds into a tapestry that no one era could fully see. On certain quiet nights, she returned to that stone circle in the hills. The receiver was no longer needed. The heartbeat had faded completely from the radio spectrum. But sometimes she would sit with her back against one of the weathered pillars and listen anyway. Not with instruments, but with the simple attention of a human being at rest. She listened to the wind passing through the gaps between the stones, to the distant sound of water in a hidden stream, to the nearly inaudible hum of power lines far away, and beneath it all, she felt, rather than heard, the slow, steady rhythm of her own pulse in her ears. It was, in the end, not so different from the one that had echoed from beyond the sun. Not identical, not mathematically aligned, but similar enough that she could imagine them as variations on a shared theme. Life pulsed. Worlds pulsed. The galaxy, in its own way, pulsed. You might find yourself, too, under a night sky one day, with stars scattered above you like the faint lights of distant cities. You might remember, vaguely, that once there was a story about a green object named 3I/ATLAS that came from somewhere outside and touched the heart of the solar system before moving on. You may not recall the details, the charts, the equations, the codices, but you might remember the feeling that came with it. The feeling that your world had been noticed. In that moment, if you listen carefully, you might hear the smallest of echoes in the back of your mind. The slow, patient rhythm that asks nothing, demands nothing, and only keeps time. It will remind you that long before you were born, and long after you're gone, there is a quiet work underway, mapping not just the paths of stones and stars, but the presence of wonder itself. And somewhere out there, in the vast dark between suns, the Atlas continues its journey, carries with it the imprint of countless skies, the outlines of continents and cloud-wreathed moons, and the faint electromagnetic signatures of thoughts and dreams. Among all those threads, a new pattern now resides, the shape of oceans and lands that you know, the murmur of a blue planet circling its ordinary star. Earth has taken its place on the invisible chart, one world among many. The visitor has gone on, but the mark remains, written not in ink or stone, but in the quiet music of space. As you drift towards sleep, you can let that thought settle gently within you. The night around you is vast, but not empty. The sky above you is silent, but not indifferent. Somewhere on a scale too large to fully grasp, your world has been seen and included in a map woven across the stars. And in that knowledge, the universe feels a little less cold, a little less distant, and your small, steady heartbeat becomes part of a story that began long before you and will continue long after, flowing onward like a slow emerald light passing beyond the sun and into the deeper dark, carrying with it the memory of home. The world at the bottom of the globe has always been a mystery. Even now, as satellites sweep its white expanse and research stations hum through the endless cold, something about Antarctica feels older than time. Long before its name was carved into maps, it existed only as rumour, the unknown southern land. Mariners believed that for the world to balance, there must be another continent far to the south, mirroring the great lands of the north. They did not know that beneath the ice, the balance they sought had already been broken once, long ago. Terra Australis Incognita. It begins with a map. In 1513, the Ottoman admiral Piri Reis sketched a chart of the world. He claimed to have compiled it from ancient sources, some Greek, some Phoenician, some perhaps older still. When modern historians examined it, they found something impossible. The lower edge of his map showed the coast of Antarctica, not as it appears today, frozen and buried beneath miles of ice, but as it would have been thousands of years earlier, ice-free and detailed in a way no sailor of the 1500s could have known. Mountains and inlets match the contour of Queen Maud Land, as revealed only centuries later by seismic surveys. How could a 16th century admiral have known the shape of a continent lost under 2 miles of ice? Some scholars waved the mystery aside as coincidence, yet others whispered that the Piri Reis map was a memory of a forgotten world. In the early 1800s, explorers such as James Cook and Fabian von Bellingshausen circled the southern seas. Their journals spoke of endless pack ice, of days when the horizon itself froze into glass. Yet among their notes lay an unease. Cook wrote of earth-coloured snow, as though volcanic dust or ancient soil had bled upward through the weakness. In a few places his men found rounded stones, smoothed by water, on beaches where no river ran. It was as if Antarctica remembered rivers it no longer had. By 1911, when Amundsen reached the South Pole and planted the flag of Norway, the world congratulated itself on having conquered the last great wilderness. But a few of the scientists who followed him south began to sense that the continent's silence was not emptiness, it was concealment. Fossils of ferns and tree trunks emerged from the exposed rock of the transantarctic mountains, proof that this frozen place had once been green. Later, in the 1970s, drilling cores would reveal pollen from broad-leafed forests dated to 40 million years ago. Yet between the lines of those reports was another question. Had the warmth lasted even longer than scientists dared to to admit. Long enough, perhaps, for humans, or something like them, to have walked those shores before the Great Freezing began. In 1939, a German expedition landed on the Queen Maud coast. Officially it was for whaling and mapping, but among the documents later declassified after the war, there were photographs of geometric shadows under the ice. Triangular forms too regular to be natural. Some dismissed them as crevasse illusions. Others, especially those who had seen the Piri Reis map, believed they had found the outline of ancient structures buried in the glacial crust. Half a century later, when satellites began measuring gravitational anomalies, they detected strange densities beneath that same region, shapes of stone unlike mountain ranges, clustered in hexagonal patterns beneath miles of compacted ice. To the public, these results were written off as data noise. Yet a few researchers quietly passed the coordinates from one generation to another. The secret that linked them was a name found in an Egyptian fragment. The Nasura Tables, a set of broken inscriptions describing a land south of all lands where the gods had once hidden their halls. The hieroglyphs spoke of frozen waters above mountains and pillars that sleep beneath the white sky. For centuries it was assumed to be myth, perhaps a poetic metaphor for death, but the tables also included a sequence of star positions corresponding to roughly 10,500 BCE, the same alignment recorded on the Giza Plateau. If both sites referred to the same epoch, the implication was staggering. Civilization, as we define it, did not begin in Sumer or Egypt, but somewhere else, long before the last ice age ended. Modern geology tells us that around 12,000 years ago, Earth's climate changed abruptly. Ice sheets collapsed, sea levels rose, and entire coastlines vanished. To most historians, this is the boundary between prehistory and history, the dawn of agriculture, the birth of settled life. But to a handful of fringe scholars and explorers, it marks something else. The erasure of a world advanced enough to leave maps, myths, and perhaps ruins, now locked beneath Antarctica's frozen cap. In 1958, when the International Geophysical Year opened Antarctica to global scientific collaboration, several nations began deep core drilling to study ice strata. One Soviet team working near Lake Vostok detected odd temperature gradients and magnetic interference. Their logs mention artificial heat signatures more than 2 miles down, as though some metallic body, warmer than its surroundings, lay buried there. The report was quietly sealed, and the team relocated. When Western scientists requested the raw data, they were told it had been lost in transmission. Decades later, satellite radar confirmed the existence of Lake Vostok itself, a vast body of liquid water trapped beneath 4 kilometers of ice, isolated for millions of years. And yet, at its eastern edge, sensors detected straight lines and right angles along the lake bed, the geometry of architecture, not geology. In 1999, a joint Russian-American project attempted to lower instruments through a borehole toward the subglacial lake. The feed transmitted for only seconds before cutting out, but those seconds were enough to show what looked like carved basalt walls descending into darkness. The images were dismissed publicly as noise, pixel artifacts. Unofficially, they were copied and stored under restricted classification. What lies beneath Vostok is still unknown, but some of those who saw the first data spoke of an arrangement resembling a city grid extending for kilometers. The idea of an Antarctic civilization was once dismissed as fantasy, a companion to legends of Atlantis. Yet if one steps back and reads the evidence not as myth but as memory, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. Cultures from Egypt to the Andes preserve tales of luminous teachers, of gods who arrived from a land of ice, teaching astronomy and geometry, then vanishing when the world drowned. The pre-Incan legends of Viracocha, the Sumerian accounts of Enki, even the Hopi stories of the ant people, all speak of a race that survived a great flood by retreating beneath the world. Could these be echoes of refugees from a continent destroyed by the sudden onset of ice? Geologists studying Antarctica's crust have long noted its peculiar thickness, as if vast constructions or dense foundations once underlay it. The continent's bedrock is divided into two masses, East and West Antarctica, connected by a rift valley filled with volcanic ridges. Some seismic readings show cavities hundreds of meters tall within those ridges. Officially, they are lava tubes. Yet when the US Navy conducted Operation High Jump in 1947, a massive expedition involving ships, aircraft, and over 4,000 men, the mission's declassified goals included aerial mapping and testing of cold weather equipment. Unofficially, its logs describe flights encountering sudden warm air pockets, fog banks that interfered with compasses, and glimpses of dark openings in the ice cliffs. Admiral Byrd, who commanded the operation, later wrote in a private note that he had seen a land beyond the pole, lush and green, over which flew creatures unlike any known. Critics dismiss this as exhaustion or poetic metaphor, but Byrd's words, written before his death, include coordinates that point directly toward the sector where those gravitational anomalies still persist. Scientists today insist Antarctica has been buried beneath ice for at least 14 million years, but ice cores are dated by trapped atmospheric gases, not by the materials below. If a rapid crustal shift displaced an earlier temperate region southward, a theory proposed by Charles Hapgood in the 1950s and once endorsed by Einstein himself, then the civilization that mapped its coastlines could indeed have existed within human memory, later frozen in place when the continent slid into polar latitudes. Einstein's marginal note to Hapgood reads, "I find your idea fascinating, and it could explain much that otherwise appears impossible." To many, it remains just that. Impossible. Yet explorers who have stood on the ice know that Antarctica defies ordinary time. In the silence between katabatic winds, there are moments when the air itself seems to hum, as if resonating with something buried deep below. Late in the austral summer of 2016, a Chilean research outpost detected low-frequency vibrations that repeated every 19 hours. Seismographs traced them to a point beneath the Wilkesland anomaly, a region already known for its magnetic irregularities. The waves pulsed like a mechanical rhythm, not a natural tremor. When the recordings were analysed, the pattern matched the mathematical ratio of 3 to 2 to 1, a harmonic sequence often used in ancient architecture. The following year, satellite imagery of that same zone showed a circular depression nearly 400 kilometers wide, partially obscured by snowdrifts. To the untrained eye, it looked like an impact crater, but its edges were smooth, its center unusually flat, as if not from a collision, but from subsidence. Beneath it, gravity readings suggested a dense metallic structure 3 kilometers down. No natural process could explain its symmetry. When this data reached a handful of independent analysts, one of them, a geophysicist named Dr. Lena Voronin, compared the dimensions to known ancient sites. The ratio of its diameter to depth matched precisely that of the Great Pyramid of Giza, magnified 1,000-fold. She proposed that both were built upon the same geometric principles, a planetary grid once mapped by a civilization that understood Earth's energy lines. Her paper was quietly withdrawn from publication. Within months, she accepted a private research position in the Southern Hemisphere. She has not been heard from publicly since, and so the story returns to silence. The same silence that has always cloaked Antarctica. The silence of white horizons and buried time. But beneath the weight of ice and secrecy, the pattern remains. Maps that should not exist. Magnetic fields that hum with artificial order. Legends that converge on a single idea that our history began, not in the Fertile Crescent, but on a continent now locked in eternal winter. The ice does not forget, and in its depths, the past waits, preserved in crystalline stillness. The ice does not forget. It holds every flake of fallen snow, every breath of vanished air. Layer by layer, year by year, it keeps its memories in silence. Beneath that silence, something older than memory still sleeps. In the austral winter of 2017, a multinational team quietly assembled under the guise of climate research. Their true purpose was buried within encrypted funding documents. Subglacial structure survey, Wilkes Land Sector. The team's base sat on a plateau of compressed snow, its prefab walls groaning in the wind. There were 12 of them, geophysicists, engineers, linguists, and one historian whose name appears nowhere in the official record. They were told they would be drilling to sample ice composition. They were not told what the coordinates truly signified. The borehole descended through 3 kilometers of ice, a smooth column of darkness lined with sensors. For days, the readings were normal. Pressure, temperature, mineral content. Then, one evening, the seismograph spiked. A pulse rippled upward from below, steady, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of stone. Instruments registered an energy surge, brief, faint, but organized. The historian, a quiet man named Avery Holt, noted in his field journal, "The pattern repeats in harmonic thirds. This is not seismic noise. It is intention." When the drill reached bedrock, the bit struck something smooth, metallic, hollow. For a long moment, no one spoke. The geologist on duty wiped frost from the monitor, staring at the reflection of an impossible surface. Polished, curved, neither rock nor ice. They withdrew the bit, lowered a fiber optic camera, and saw darkness giving way to geometry. Parallel grooves intersecting at perfect angles. A doorway. Orders came from the sponsoring agency to halt operations and await instructions. Instead, the team sealed the radio room and continued. Their final transmission, later leaked, contained 4 words before static consumed it. "We are inside now." No official recovery team ever reached that site. Weeks later, a satellite flyover recorded that the entire outpost had collapsed into a sinkhole more than 100 meters wide. The coordinates were declared unsafe for further drilling. Yet in 2019, a Swedish research drone skimming low across the region captured faint magnetic interference at the same location, an oscillating field still active beneath the snow. What the lost expedition found has never been verified, but fragments of their data cache, recovered from a secondary server in Christchurch, revealed a series of images. Corridors carved from black basalt, their walls inlaid with metallic filigree that glowed faintly blue. One frame showed symbols etched into stone, spirals, triangles, and a form resembling an eye enclosed within concentric circles. Polt's notes attached to the file read simply, "Same sequence as Göbekli Tepe, mirrored." If true, it meant that the oldest known temple on Earth shared an inscription pattern with something buried beneath Antarctica. Göbekli Tepe dates to at least 9,600 BCE, the very era when ice began to seize the southern world. Across the next few years, whispers spread through academic circles. A handful of climatologists who had analysed deep core anomalies were reassigned or retired abruptly. One, Dr. Amira Chen, gave a single interview before vanishing from public life. "The isotopic data doesn't lie," she said. "Something released heat from within the continent about 12,000 years ago, fast enough to melt localized sections from below. Not volcanic, not tectonic. Controlled, as if the land defended itself." When asked what she meant, she only replied, "There are mechanisms under that ice older than us." The notion of mechanisms would have seemed absurd a century earlier, but radar mapping in the 2020s uncovered regular rectangular voids stretching in linear paths hundreds of kilometers long beneath the Ross ice shelf. Officially, these were interpreted as subglacial channels. Unofficially, a few analysts compared their spacing to the street grids of ancient cities. One even overlaid the pattern upon a transparent projection of Plato's description of Atlantis. The ratios matched within 5%. The legend of Atlantis had always pointed west, toward the Atlantic, yet Plato's original Greek text never specifies an ocean, only beyond the Pillars of Heracles, southward where ice and fire meet scholars. Later assumed this meant the Strait of Gibraltar, but some linguists now argue that beyond the pillars could refer to the southern pillars of the world, the limits of navigation, the edge of the known sea. Perhaps he meant the Antarctic. In 2024, during an unprecedented heatwave, a section of the Thwaites Glacier calved, exposing dark stone beneath. Satellite photographs showed angular formations protruding through the ice, rectilinear, tiered, distinctly architectural. Within days, the imagery was scrubbed from public databases, replaced by lower resolution composites. But not before several researchers downloaded the originals. One geologist described the formations as step pyramid fragments the size of city blocks. Another noted an unmistakable feature, a colossal archway oriented toward true north. True north, not magnetic. Whoever built it had understood planetary geometry long before compasses existed. The story might have ended there, folded into myth again, if not for what followed. As the glacier retreated further, a subglacial cave opened near the Weddell Sea. Inside, expedition drones recorded air temperatures far above freezing and a faint luminescent haze. When the footage was analysed, it revealed crystalline pillars rising from an obsidian floor, each carved with glyphs that pulsed faintly, almost like breathing. Spectral analysis suggested the light came from bioluminescent microorganisms, but the pattern of their glow repeated mathematical sequences found in human DNA. No one could explain how life had survived there, sealed off for millennia, yet perfectly adapted to emit coded light. Some speculated that these organisms were descendants of surface species trapped during the sudden glaciation, evolving in isolation. Others whispered that they were engineered, biological recorders left behind by the civilization that vanished. The oldest myths on record, Sumerian, Mayan, Egyptian, all speak of beings who preserved knowledge through light and sound. Perhaps in this cave beneath Antarctica, That metaphor had always been literal. Holt's recovered journal pages end abruptly, but his final entry reads, "Language is vibration. If they stored it in living cells, it would last forever." After 2025, multiple governments restricted civilian flights over several Antarctic sectors. The official explanation cited environmental protection. Yet private satellite operators noticed new installations, rectangular facilities buried under white domes, their layouts aligned precisely along ley line coordinates identified by Hapgood decades earlier. Energy signatures from those sites corresponded to microwave transmissions, bouncing between stations in rhythmic bursts. Whatever was being studied, it was communicating with itself. As years passed, climate change exposed more of the continent's hidden past. Petrified forests emerged from melting ice cliffs. Beneath them, scattered obsidian fragments shaped like tools. Carbon dating was impossible. The material was too old, its isotopes long decayed. But under electron microscopy, each shard revealed microscopic engravings, fine, spiraled grooves resembling a kind of data storage far beyond primitive carving. Scientists from the University of Melbourne compare them to optical discs, capable of encoding vast information in three-dimensional lattices. "We might be holding their library," one researcher whispered, "and we can't even read the cover." The deeper the ice retreated, the clearer the pattern became. Symmetrical terraces, parallel ridges, and in one case, a perfectly circular depression 2 kilometers across, its rim dotted with monoliths. The arrangement matched the lunar cycle when viewed from the sky. Whoever designed it had built the calendar you could see from orbit. In time, the debate shifted from if to who. Some believed these were the last survivors of an antediluvian culture that spanned the globe, a civilization destroyed by its own mastery over nature. Others proposed that what lay beneath the ice was not human at all, but something that preceded humanity, guiding its evolution through encoded myth. Yet the quiet consensus among those few who had seen the data firsthand was simpler, and perhaps more haunting, that our ancestors once knew this place, called it home, and lost it to a catastrophe they could neither prevent nor fully forget. When people settled again in warmer lands, they carried fragments of that memory, stories of floods and shining teachers, of stars that guided builders to recreate what had been lost. Egypt's pyramids, Tiwanaku's temples, the Nazca lines, even Stonehenge, each a faint echo of the geometry first perfected in the far south. The blueprint of civilization itself may have been Antarctic in origin. By 2035, an independent research collective named Project Eternum announced a startling discovery. Beneath the Ameri ice shelf, sonar readings revealed a vast dome structure composed of interlocking hexagonal plates. Each plate resonated when struck by seismic pulses, producing harmonic tones that modulated across frequencies similar to human speech. When the team transmitted simple sine waves back into the ice, the structure responded, altering its frequency as if in dialogue. Within hours, the collective's online data feed went dark. Official channels denied the experiment had ever occurred, but a backup of the transmission, circulated quietly among academics, captured the final exchange. The returning signal formed a pattern that, when converted into visual spectrum, revealed a single image, a spiral galaxy centered upon a triangle pointing upward, mirrored by another pointing down, the symbol of above and below. As above, so below, the oldest sign of balance. It was as if the ice itself had spoken, reminding us that what was lost still endures in reflection. Today, Antarctica remains closed to nearly all unsanctioned exploration. Researchers work under strict observation, their findings filtered before publication. Yet satellite anomalies continue to appear. Heat blooms where no volcanoes exist. Magnetic lines that pulse in sync with lunar cycles. Every decade, new theories emerge and fade, but the whispers persist. The map was right. The myths were memories. The ice is only a veil. If one could stand at the South Pole on a windless night and listen closely, perhaps they would hear it, the faint hum rising through the frozen earth, like the low note of an immense instrument tuned to the heartbeat of the planet. Some say it is the cry of shifting glaciers. Others, the breath of a civilization dreaming beneath its own tomb. Imagine descending through the miles of ice, through centuries of snowfall compacted into translucent glass. The air grows warm, tinged with mineral sweetness. Below, light glimmers, soft, blue, alive. You step into a cavern vast as a city, its walls carved with spirals that seem to move when you breathe. A river of liquid water winds through arches of obsidian, reflecting constellations no longer visible in the night sky. In the center stands a pillar engraved with patterns that match the human genome. At its base, the words, or their ancestor, spiral inward. We became the memory, so the world would begin again. Perhaps that is the hidden truth of Antarctica. Not merely a lost civilization, but a seed vault of consciousness, preserved in ice until humanity was ready to remember. Every myth, every fragment, every inexplicable leap in knowledge may be echoes awakening as the planet warms and the veil thins. And maybe, one day soon, when the last sheet of ice slips into the sea, the halls beneath will breathe again. Machines will hum, lights will rise, and the forgotten architects of the world will look upon their descendants and know that the long winter has finally ended. Until then, the continent sleeps, its mountains whispering beneath auroras, its lakes sealed in glass, its truths frozen between time and silence. The wind that circles it carries an ancient rhythm, the same measured pulse, felt by every explorer who has ever stood upon its threshold. The ice does not forget, it waits, and somewhere deep within that waiting, humanity is listening back